Why do we record? We are living through a time when the microphone is an everyday part of our life. So it might seem just a little strange to investigate what it is that we do when we record and why we do it. When I started out as a teenage musician, time in front of the microphone was the exception rather than the rule for most performance. And no aspect of what it meant to record, nor any technical help, was given here at the Academy. In addition, like many musicians, my first recording sessions in professional studios were in order to produce tapes for competition entries. Under the understanding, which interestingly was never stated in the entry requirements, that these should not be edited or enhanced in any other way. Bearing in mind this was in pre-digital times, this was an interesting requirement and quite unpoliceable, but it was considered a matter of honour. This meant that early encounters with a microphone and producer had a somewhat nail-bitten quality, reflected in rather over-serious outcomes and a general continuing neurosis about the process. So it was a considerable shock for me when at the end of my first year here at the Academy, I was given the opportunity to spend 2 whole days recording a recital of Beethoven and Mozart at BBC Maida Vale 2. This was before the days of what would be later called producer choice, where networks still saw the virtue of recording a recital as if one was making a studio recording. Please note we were still in pre-digital times. So the chance to luxuriate in the Kreutzer Sonata and 2 Mozart sonatas with no pressure was an extraordinary, almost shocking experience, which in the context of the earlier high-pressure encounters with a microphone had the unwanted result of making too much air come out of the balloon all at once. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the results weren't that exciting. As I mentioned earlier, in my late teens and early 20s, there was still very little expectation that many of us would be recording regularly. There had been, of course, notable exceptions. Earlier, when I was still at school, the impact of the 18-year-old Robert Cohen's recording of the Dvorak Concerto was enormous. Or, like the impact of Nigel Kennedy's exquisite first recording of the Elgar Concerto. But these were exceptions. There was a sense that the golden age of recording had just passed us. This, to a degree, was perhaps true, but things were about to change. I mention these 2 early experiences by way of pointing out that it's important for us to find a balance in our relationship with the microphone. One thing which has vanished, I hope for good, is the formerly combative relationship of this balance which I witnessed between my teachers and their producers. This, of course, was partially related to the question of who had control. Turning pages of my teacher, the Armenian violinist Manuk Prekyan, who was recording Medtner sonatas with the recently lost Hamish Milne, I was shocked to hear Manuk say, after he played a wrong note, albeit completely in tune, "Oh, he won't hear that. Let's see if we can get it by him." He went straight past the producer, who was off mic when the remark was dropped, and the wrong note is on the recording. The clear sense was that this was not really the artist's responsibility, and I'll speak to the question of ownership and control later. A more tragic instance was following the death of the great violinist Earalf Holmes, who just recorded the complete Delius works for violin and orchestra before he died. The recording was edited and mastered while he was on his deathbed. After his death, his widow, Jeanette, described to me being at an editing session where a pause was discussed, and the conductor, Vernon Handley, and producer decided that it was too long. The razor blade came out, and the offending 5 seconds of silence ended up, quite literally, on the cutting room floor. Jeanette disagreed, but it was made clear to her that this was really not her call. She said to me, "I carried that piece of tape around in my handbag for years afterwards." So finding our way to having control, taking responsibility for our recordings, is central to how and why we record in the first place. And we need to never lose awareness that the question is always there, whatever our relationship to the microphone and in whatever type of recording we find ourselves. What I really wish to focus on, and we wish to focus on in these sessions, is situations where one finds ways of getting this control, having this control. Inevitably, this is a learning process, and one which perhaps never stops. It certainly hasn't for me. To begin with, we need to ask ourselves the question about why we might be making a recording in the first place. The first and most obvious answer might be because we've been hired to do it. Perhaps this sounds obvious, but in any circumstance, any commercial output by any artist will be a motley of instances where the performer is a hired gun and those where they are the prime mover. There's no way that the listener or the buyer can tell the difference. I have at present about 60 or 70 odd discs available commercially, and there's no way that any of you could tell which were mine and which were not, because naturally enough, once you establish a profile as an artist, you will be asked to do the things that you specialize in. And if you're lucky, your specialities and your interests will be the same thing, or at least coincide. I think it's not such a bad idea to quickly run through a handful of the things which a recording might serve or illustrate. If I think about recordings by other artists that I've come to value and love, these might be originality or creativity, virtuosity or spirit of exploration. But they also might be documentation, library recording, or to be honest, even advertising. This morning I've been listening to Benny Goodman's Basin Street recordings, which I might say hit all the earlier targets. But at various times, for instance, you might find, as a listening musician, that you would have been interested in a recording because it introduced you to a piece of music, whilst at the same time convincing you that it needed a different recording, a recording made by you. This would be a far from ideal result from the original artist's point of view, but it has a function. And at some time or another, many musicians will have been handed the instruction, often coming down from the corporate end of a large recording company, that what was required was a library recording, an example of what the piece was, not what they might do with it. When you're being paid, for instance, for a concerto recording of something from the canon that you're excited about, this can be an interesting make or break moment. I don't mind admitting that I've walked off at least one project at some cost, especially when you walk out of a studio somewhere in Eastern Europe, out of your hotel, which you then have to pay for, into a taxi, which you then have to pay for, to an airport where you have to buy another ticket, lose all the money you were supposed to be paid, and are liable for all the costs of the recording up to that point. The question of how you feed your young family at these moments is, to put it mildly, a little desperate. So it's preferable, anyway from my point of view, to find ways of exercising, of having control in recording. I'll come back to this again, as I said, later. Secondly, that set of possibilities of what a recording might be can be viewed from another set of standpoints. Is what we are trying to produce a truthful documentation of what happened, of what we do? Or is it perhaps a kind of proof of what we can do? If we think about competitions, or another way of thinking, what we can do under pressure, the ability to produce. Having the chops or the time, money or virtuosity is necessary, for instance, for the world of sessions, where this is everything. Or perhaps we might find that the relationship to the studio that liberates us from these things, one which you might say involves a curious denial of the... Or do we find our own relationship with studio that liberates us from all those concerns which in some way involve a curious denial of the opportunities the studio offers? Any answer, your answer to the question, might be conditioned by commercial concerns. And these are concerns to a lesser or greater degree, whether or not you're tied to market considerations. Recordings cost money. In recording, there's always a balance of influence, of significance between the artist, which in this case is everyone involved in what we will call the creative aspect of the recording, and the industry, which perhaps usefully can be seen as everything from record companies to, say, the distribution agents. Both of these wings include critical frameworks and hurdles, which range from the standards set by the artists themselves, and on the other end, those set by the industry. These are not always, in fact not often, the same, and the relationship between these two is complicated and constantly shifts. These commercial concerns, as everywhere in the musical world, will be framed by a balance between corporate and independent areas of activity. These always have a relationship, and to a greater or lesser degree, at different moments, cannot live without each other. But it's an uneasy one, and in the recording world, often expresses itself a little brutally. I say this carefully, but it's the truth. The easiest scapegoat for large organizations are individuals, and there are no easier individual targets than artists, because there are simply always too many of us, and as we've been reminded by our Chancellor, we are, by definition, unviable. So many artists who record like I have found ways to be at once part of the industry, whilst keeping industry muscle at arm's length. So let's get back to the question of, why do you record? Any answer to this question is going to be multifaceted, and at times a little Janus-faced. At any given time, even the independent recording artist will be having to give different answers to that question within hours or even within the same days. So it's worth asking whether the answer to why you're recording is, for instance, practical. I mean, for instance, you might, need a calling card to demonstrate what you can do. It might be inspirational. As I mentioned earlier, it could be that you have been inspired by a performance or a recording of somebody that you admire, or that you've been inspired by a recording that you hate. Your conviction, you really want to do it better than that, to show it can be done differently. Or perhaps the most exciting one, the kind of idea of a motivational approach to recording. The belief that you really, really want to bring something to the microphone. You want to share something with people. It can be either a piece or it can be an approach to the piece. For instance, most recent recording I just released of the 3 early Schubert sonatas for piano and violin was the direct result of the harpsichordist and forte pianist Julian Perkins coming to me and saying, we need to talk about these sonatas, and I think there's some mileage if we explore them on a little square piano. That began a year and a half of experimentation and research, which gradually took us to the recording studio, and eventually 3 years later a recorded output. But it began with, if you like, his motivation, which drove mine. It might not come from you, it might come from somebody else. So let's get down to some practicalities. Over the next few weeks, Daniel-Ben Pienaar and I will circle around these a number of times. We will repeat ourselves in the manner of recording itself, because recording is all about doing it again. Take 2, take 3, take 4, take 5. We'll ask questions in different ways and from different angles and come up with different answers. Let's begin with practice. This might sound very obvious, but I think it's important to begin asking the question of how our personal practice regimes, as artists will call it, our actual practice, relates or doesn't relate to the processes and outcomes for which we are preparing. Just to state the obvious, we need to ask the question whether or not we prepare differently for different recorded or performing eventualities. I think the answer is obvious to all of us, but the inquiry needs to be made. By way of illustration, if I'm going to play solo Bach on the 1628 Amati violin that I usually use, then I will practice towards the characteristics of that instrument, even if I don't practice on that instrument. If I decide I want to use a different violin, such as the earlier Brescian violin, or even, say, a late 19th century violin, that will affect my preparation. I presume that my work on the different violin will not be reactive, but proactive, even preactive, pre-planned. Now, I don't want to suggest that you want to remove the possibility, the expectation of discovery or spontaneity, but I think it's worth saying that in recording, as in all things, we need to be sure that the foundations have been laid for what we do in practice. We need to target the practice. So, how is our practice targeted to record? Put simply, is our work at our practice desk calibrated or recalibrated to best suit the things that recording can offer to us? The studio is different from the stage. Just think about, for instance, the sensitivity of the microphone to timbre and colour, even if you just think of it in terms of not so much of a microphone as a microscope. This will affect the way that you not only play, but we need to ask the question of whether or not it affects the way that you prepare for playing. So how do we think ahead for that? Another way of looking at our practice is to ask, is it a kind of general practice, or is the recording itself that? If, for instance, the recording is an example of what happens, like effectively a recording of a performance with, or a proof or demonstration of ability. Though if you think about it, it's questionable whether there's really a logic of not using all the available tools in the studio to enhance this. There are a number of occasions, which are not always conditioned by the live aesthetic, where a non-take-two situation is either desirable or necessary. This can result in exciting or undesirable results. An example of this from some years ago is Michael Finnis's work for string quartet, Nobody's Jig. This is a 25-minute long work for four players. It's not even, he wouldn't even describe it as a quartet, with 4 independent scores, which are designed to end at the same time, and they're very tightly written without any repeating bars and no cues between the parts, so there's no way of knowing where you are, which means in a recording situation there is no way of taking or retaking any part of the recording. This means that to record this piece means that if you're going to do, say, 3 takes of it, you're going to need, just for 3 takes, you're going to need at least an hour and a half, and that's if you just play it straight through. When we recorded this, as so often we were recording in a church, and the venue had not notified the bell ringers that we were going to be recording, and just as we were going to record the take, which was hopefully going to be the one we were going to use, because the previous takes, the ending had not lined up anyway usefully, the bell ringers came stamping into the church and demanding that we left. This necessitated, as happened to me a number of times, me to get my wallet out and to suggest that instead of bell ringing, they might go to the pub instead. At some point later, I will talk about the continuing adventure of planning for bell ringers, lawnmowers, sextons, grave diggers, road workers, etc. So back to the practice desk. So perhaps it's a good idea to see the work that we do at the practice desk as, if you like, pre-recording. I think we should ask the question, how much does the work that we do at the practice desk mirror or map what happens in the studio? How much are we actually creating a map at a scale of 1 to 1? A little bit like the exploded view instruction sheets of model kits or Lego. One might even think of the practice desk as being something like a dry run, like fitting the parts of the model together but without glue, but with a file and a piece of sandpaper at hand, so you can find what pieces don't fit before you're committed in front of the microphone. Now, some of us will do this first of all by making rough drafts, test runs, with and without the microphone. In my case, the most important tool that I always have at my desk is a timer. I've got it with me here now. As I practice, I constantly time each section, and I keep a record over days and weeks of how these timings flux as my reading of any piece morphs and changes. I also need to be aware of what will happen as soon as the situation gets or goes live, when the real or figurative red light goes on. Though in my world, there's never really a red light. But depending on the dramatic nature of the music you're playing, you'll find that there's a fascinating relationship between these timings when you work at them on the practice desk and what happens in recording. It's always a surprise. On Monday night, I was recording solo works by the Baltimore-based composer Michael Hirsch, and I timed them as always. But as I should have expected, in recording on Monday, in each case, the pieces worked out to be about 1/6 longer. Now, this effect tends to be exaggerated in multi-movement pieces for obvious reasons. The obvious thing is that each time you have the pause at the beginning, the end of a piece, which has dramatic function, these will tend to be drawn out when you are in performance, even if you're performing to a microphone in a space, these will stretch out. A second reason for spending time at the practice desk with the timer is to get an idea of your time needs when you are recording. Whilst you want to avoid being in a situation as much as you possibly can where the clock is ticking down, it's a very good idea that you avoid that partially by coming up with a map based partially on your use of the timer, which tells you how long you think you're going to need to get from A to B and to B to C as you work yourself through the score in the recording. And of course, the third and most obvious thing is that the biggest challenge, even as we go into increasingly a non-CD based environment, is to make sure that what you're going to do is going to fit in the means that you use to distribute it. Still, a CD is defined normally as being somewhere between 69 or, curiously, 59 minutes, and the outer limit of what you can fit on a CD, which is 89 minutes. So you need to make sure that what you're doing fits comfortably within those parameters, and breaking them in either direction can be very problematic, although there are situations where record companies, for instance, will make the decision that it's a good idea, for instance, to release something short because it reflects the music. When we recorded the Roberto Gerhard quartets, two very fine, tightly wrought pieces, the idea of putting anything else on the disc would simply seem to be wrong, and anything else would break the balance which had been established by these pieces. And so Metier, the company who released them for us, when we recorded them, decided it would be okay to release a 40-minute disc. But that is going to be the exception rather than the rule. By the same token, you want to avoid coming to a situation where, for instance, your recording works out at 91 minutes. I'm in the middle of editing the Welsmeyer Scordatura partitas for solo violin from the 1690s. And these 6 pieces, if you play them as I normally would do in a concert with the full repeats, work out at about 93 minutes. Well, that means that clearly the obvious way to get around that problem is to take a view on repeat usage, and I'm sure that Daniel-Ben Pienaar will want to talk about that a little bit when he gets to his first talking about his session, which is you want to make sure, obviously, that your choice about repeats, if it is conditioned, for instance, by what might fit on a disc, then doesn't become a compromise. On the other hand, this is something which is worth taking care of and making sure that you have oversight with. My first of my 2 recordings of the Telemann Fantasies, where I didn't have control as a producer. It was before I'd started doing that. It only discovered maybe 3 months after we'd released the disc that one of the binary movements had 3 readings of the second half. Interestingly, no critic the second half of one of the movements. Interestingly, no critic so far has picked that up, although they've picked many other things up. Now, a vital part of this process of the run-up is breaking down the score. Naturally, this will tend to reflect the structure of the score itself. Now, it's an obvious thing to say that if you're recording a piece in 3 movements, you normally, unless it was extraordinary circumstances, would record those movements separately from each other. If it is a sonata form movement, then it's very likely that you naturally will break it up at the very least between the exposition and the development and recapitulation. If it's a sonata form movement where you have repeat in the first half, then that starts to become interesting. And for anybody who has spent any time recording a lot of Baroque dance movements, this question of how you work your way into finding the shape or the structure of either binary or ternary movements is really interesting. Also, one of the things you'll learn very early on in the process is, whilst it's fine to, say, keep playing the A section until you're done and then move on to the B section, there are many of us will recognize the situation of realizing that if you're not careful, you'll only have 1 or 2 recordings of the move from the A to the B section, which means that, say, if you're recording in anything approaching an acoustic and you need to go from one to the other, and most particularly when you come back to the tonic, say back to the dominant in the middle of the piece, it really doesn't help you if you don't have at least more than one versions of this where you can actually go back from the tonic to the dominant, not just the dominant to the dominant of the A to the B section. These are kind of things you learn along the way. I think that any musician will say that the breaking down of the score, the techniques of doing this will vary over time. At any moment you might have what might seem to be a very logical way, for instance, of using what might seem to be dramatic sections, but then you might move to more of a kind of feathered, interleaved way of mapping this. So if you, again, working with any engineer, they're always going to be interested in avoiding, for instance, cold start material. So that means your question is always going to be whether on how much of a tail you choose to give yourself. One of the problems with too much overlap is that unless you're keeping very, very careful notes, you may give yourself an exhausting listening process to make decisions when, for instance, if you've recorded section A going into section B and there's an overlap of, say, 2 or 3 minutes, and you have to make a decision of not only how do you get from one to the other, but which of the overlaps you use. And say you've done 4 or 5 takes of each section, that suddenly means, particularly if you're in a repeated movement, you might have not just 10, but 20 versions of the same overlapped material, which gives it far too much importance. So this is something to think about. The most obvious thing to say here is you don't want to be puzzling this out in the studio. Now, this is not really because of the kind of time stress issue, but because music making itself and the sort of hanging out around it should be the only activity that happens in the studio. A word here about producers. It has been my experience that in 95% of the time, particularly in this country, producers will not have thought the questions out that I've just been talking about. It's particularly when I've worked with a producer I don't know, it's quite rare, particularly when the producer has a reputation of being very successful, it's quite rare that they'll have spent any time working on the score before you arrive. If you're working in a produced situation, it's perhaps a good idea to open the conversation about how you're going to do this a good period of time before you record. And at least make sure this has been thought out in a clever way. In my experience, I very often made the mistake, I made it just before Christmas, of not anticipating that a producer would not have done this. And then it's, for instance, very awkward to find yourself in recording a concerto with, say, a large professional orchestra, and maybe 10, 15 minutes into the recording, realizing that the producer really isn't thinking carefully about this. And then what you're really wanting to do is to focus on the music itself, but you realize that you need to put your foot down and you need to wrest control. One little kind of nice anecdote of something I learned from good practice in live recording, and if you do any radio work, you might encounter the situation where you have to come back and patch a performance after a concert the same evening. Now, I've found this a little soul-destroying when you're really either wanting to go home or you may be, particularly away from the UK, want to go out and celebrate after the concert. I remember being delighted the first time broadcasting the Beethoven Augengläser and the eyeglasses duo for Bayerischer Rundfunk in Munich, when their tonmeister came up to me after the rehearsal and said, are there any tricky bits, this is awkward bits in this viola part that you'd like to get in the can before the concert so that you don't have to worry. This meant, of course, that those being in the can, they weren't perfectly well in the concert because we weren't worrying about them. And in fact, we didn't use the pre-recorded material. There's a little subtext here. It's worth remembering that for most people in any extended recording, they're not going to be comfortable or able to record something delicate or lyrical after a dose of kind of pile driving material. And of course, this is very much when it comes to piano tuning or voicing, this is a real issue. So one of the things you really need to think about and to plan for previously is this, when you are doing what I'm calling for now score mapping. Part of this, of course, is really working out the opportunities and the challenges for recording a piece of music and how best to reach them. So perhaps what I'm really talking about is pre-visualizing the editing process and mapping that forward so that editing is serving your performance in the studio and the recording and vice versa. Perhaps another way of thinking about this is of trying to erode the distance between a take sheet, which your engineer will keep if you're working with one, and the edit map. It's all a question of strategy. And remember the origins of the word. The Greek strategos means both the ranks of the army and the general, and it has the etymology of that is strata, the way that sentiment is built up and organized and metamorphized into the rock record. Now, if you think about how you map a session out, it's vital part of this is time organization. And it loops me back, I said there's going to be some repetition, as to the question of whether or not the artist is the producer or working with the producer or a second pair of ears, and if that is the case, how the hierarchy functions between the two. Putting it bluntly, who's in charge? The heart of this is bearing in mind the amount of time, the limits, if you like, in a recording session or day or group of days, is how is it going to be broken down and who decides how this is organized. And a crucial thing, whether you're working just with yourself or if you're working with other players, is what you might call the sound health of the player. After a while, you will realize about your own playing or other people's playing that, for instance, why it may be apparently logical to keep working at something until it's all right, whatever that means. Anyone who's done any editing at all will recognize a situation where, whilst a group or a player has got something right, there will be a certain kind of frayed quality to the playing, a lack of colour, or what tends to happen as well is a general raise in the dynamics. It's not uncommon, for instance, when players work again and again at something they might be finding difficult, that dynamics tend to erode, that everything finds its way to a sort of mezzo piano. And if you think about, at the very least, what anybody who's worked with a composer will recognize, the needs of a composer, what a composer is interested in, are usually going to be primarily dramatic, structural, and coloristic. And many times I've encountered a situation where a player was desperate to get something right. And in one situation with when I was producing part of a virtuosic piece by the composer Nigel Clark with a brilliant flute player, who in the middle of one of the cadenza passages in the piece, were absolutely amazing playing, was getting one hemi-demi semiquaver wrong again and again and again, and getting frustrated about it, and sitting next to the composer. He said, well, I don't know, I love this. Eventually, he got out an eraser, well, not an eraser, he got out a pen, crossed out the note that he'd written in the score, and written in what she was playing over her protest, so to liberate her from this kind of ever-decreasing circles. In fact, what had happened naturally in performance, in recording, was better. It was the natural thing. Part of what I'm talking about here is authority. Even with the self-directed, self-producing recording, this is an important area to explore and establish. It's not in order to have some kind of dictatorial system in place, but really to ensure that the number of people in the room, or by the room I mean the place the recording is happening, who have any degree of anxiety or concern about what's going on is kept to the bare minimum. If there's one rule of thumb, it's that the authority rests with the person who takes the greatest share of responsibility, primarily so that everybody else doesn't have to. In the independent recording situations that dominate most recording outside the world of sessions, this responsibility tends to lie with the person who in the past would have been seen, owing to the perceived temperament, as being the least able to shoulder those responsibilities, us, the artist. So it's worth saying that you also need to plan for how having those anxieties will affect what you do, particularly as working for many years as the leader of the Kreutzer Quartet, where I've also been producer and mapping everything. I know that I have to be very careful to make sure that my playing doesn't turn into a kind of cipher, if you like, a placeholder, while, for instance, I might be busily working on either observing what's going on or fixing problems. You're always going to have problems, so it's always got I've been talking a lot about balance. It's vital to make sure that you find a way to have that balance, and dare I say it, sometimes you might need to say you need to be selfish. So one way of doing this, for instance, would be, for instance, to say at any given moment to a colleague, do you mind if authority for the next 10 minutes goes over to you, passing the baton like a relay player. Now this can be a very healthy thing to do, but you have to make sure, and this is something which I might find my way to later on this session, or maybe in a further session, of making sure that you work out which of your colleagues are going to be people who are comfortable with this and who are not going to be comfortable with this. And also, you also want to make it very, very clear to yourself that you don't ever come up with a situation where you let somebody know that you might find that they might find such responsibility uncomfortable, because knowing that you think that will engender further problems and make them feel more uncomfortable. It's a tricky one, but one that does need to be considered all the time. So let's introduce the idea of listening at this point. At any given time in a recording, there will be greater and lesser amounts of listening going on. Once the initial setup, the finding the sound bridge, has been crossed, and that's something we'll come to later. So the question is always going to be whether that listening is going to be really active or reactive. In order to illustrate two sides of this idea, I would say the first is a thing which every musician does all the time, even if they don't realize it, which is that they listen, if I can call it that, to the idea in their mind, the sound in their mind, and that kind of listening results in a sound that comes out. There's a very interesting lecture that Jacob Collier gave in Paris recently, where he talked about the idea that the sound in his head was somewhere up here, and his ability to move towards it was, which he expressed in terms of technique, was down here. And it's constantly a question of how you move one towards the other, but also that it was vital to make sure that the sound in the head thing you're listening to is also something which is slightly beyond what you can achieve, so you've always got something to go on reaching for. And the very extreme other end of this polarized way of looking things in a recording session is when the player or players might go and listen to playback, to have a conversation or not have a conversation, and decide what they're going to do next. Now, this might be a problem-solving or an idealizing activity, or a mixture of the two. So you, for instance, might say, well, that's not working, how are we going to do that? Or the opposite will say, well, that sounds terrific, how can we, to use the obvious thing, kind of shoot this to the moon? You might say, we've got it now, what happens if we throw caution to the winds, renege temper, and use the fact that we've just listened in this way to say, now let's not do something which feels that we're trying to get it right, if you like. And in the middle of these two processes, one which is, if you like, the conceptual listening, and the one is the reactive listening, is what you might call mid-activity listening, which is either heightened or lessened by the recording process. For instance, a violinist, a fourth finger goes down high on the E string. It's a sixth of the tone flat. Now, that's not necessarily in tune or out of tune, and the player's reaction to that, your reaction to that, which in the first place may or may not be intentional, is to react to the gesture creatively. Now, rather than ameliorating the mistake, you maybe think of using it as part of the line. An illustration of how this can be a little bit desperate is a performance I was giving some years ago of the Ralph Vaughan Williams concerto with a microphone up in a rather cold church. As I got to the climax, or the quiet climax of the slow movement, I made the mistake of looking at the strings of my fingerboard. I discovered that clearly a very large blue bottle had decided that the warmest place in the church was not only on my E string round my violin, but was on the E string where precisely my fourth finger needed to go down to play that note. So there was a horrible decision-making process, and realised there was no choice, and the fourth finger went down on the note and through the blue bottle. I'm never going to forget the feeling of that. So back to that sixth of a tone flat. You listen to it while you're playing it, you react to it creatively, and rather than ameliorating the mistake, rather than making the mistake better, treating it as a mistake, you incorporate it, you make it part of the line. To a degree, everything that we do as artists is a series of such corrections. In the famous series of interviews, which the art critic David Sylvester did with the great artist Francis Bacon, they talked about this very thing. And it's worth mentioning before I go on that Bacon had one of the greatest brush techniques of the late 20th century. To paraphrase, Bacon said that for him, in the act of painting, and you can substitute playing or singing or even writing, he would have an idea of the gesture, what he was going to do next, and he would try it. And inevitably, it would go wrong. And his next action was at once a corrective one, where I got to fix that problem, fix the mistake, but at the same time layering to that would be the idea of what he was going to do next. The ideal of the next action or the next movement was intersecting with the corrective movement. And of course, that would go wrong and there will be the same intersect, and so on and so on and so on. So with regard to this kind of listening as we go, we have to ask the question of whether the recording process helps or hinders that to and fro. When I talk about hinders, the question is whether or not our ability to respond to that live experience of the unpredictability of either hand or even the voice when we do something, whether or not that can be made problematic by the idea that we are being listened to by the, if you like, the unblinking ear, if you can call it that, of the microphone? Does that enhance what we do, or does it make us cautious? And I think at various times over a period of working, most artists will have to say they will experience both sides of the equation. But the ideal thing, of course, should be the heightened listening, the what Roderick Chadwick will call attentive listening, which is made more obvious by the fact you've got this piece of technology which is listening to you, should make that process enhanced. The next thing is literally the idea of next. This is perhaps the most important word in recording, as important as reset and cut on the film set. That's the moment that somebody, and it might be you, makes a decision that you move on, that you've got enough. Now, I know that Daniel-Ben Pienaar will have a lot to say about this and probably say much in the next talk, but I want to say that this part of the process is equally hard whether you're alone or working as a group. And it finds its way through the entire process and production of a recording, from the kind of preparation through to editing, through post-production. There are two ways that we can look at this, and early experience of working with performers taught me to observe both of them carefully. The first of these is something which I used to hear a lot from producers, the "I've got enough" approach. And this can be best understood as the moment that the voice in the box reveals that they've been ticking off the list of what they still need and has covered everything. Cover is a interesting word, and it was not for some years until I started to be really jumpy about this notion of cover and to question what it meant. If you, as I did, you think about it, you might come to the following realizations. The worst was that the producer was simply aiming to fulfill the requirement of a clean rendition of the piece from A to B. Now, this pertains to the notion of a documentary or library recording that I hinted at earlier. An anecdote here is one of the most uncomfortable situations for the recording artist is when a large recording company has farmed out a recording to a producer engineer who has been given the job of managing a limited budget with no exceptions, which means that they themselves are feeling, and they know that the time that they spent on the recording is already limited by the amount of money that the recording company has given them, which means effectively that there's a double level of anxiety and threat built into it, which means that whilst the artist might be under the impression that what they are trying to do is to come up with the most exciting, the most dramatic and the most vivifying version of the music, at the same moment the recording engineer will be, or the recording engineer producer, because invariably in this circumstance it's one and the same, and the artist is not involved in the production choices, they will be simply looking at the amount of time they've got left. They will be looking and thinking about the money restrictions which have been imposed upon them, which will mean that they are covering everything from the hire of the church or recording studio or whatever video you're using, and whether or not they can make any money for the recording relative to the editing process. And they'll be wanting to make sure that what comes out from the end of a recording day like that is the simplest thing for them to put together, reducing the amount of time spent in the editing suite. And this takes us back to right to the beginning, which is based on the presupposition that the editing suite is not somewhere where you go to be creative, but it's rather somewhere where you go to be, if you like, as uncreative as possible, effectively gluing something together. Now, this is something which is a bit of a to and fro, even in an idealistic situation. I've worked with the same engineer now for over a decade, and we've made many recordings together, and we don't use a producer. And it's quite interesting that if I go in with a very, very cleanly or obviously organized edit map and it goes together like water and there's no problem, we'll get to the end of the day and it won't be tiring and I'll be very pleased, and he'll say, yeah, but I really haven't really had to do much work, it hasn't not that much interesting for me. But I know, but by the same token, this is no insult to him, it's just a fact, that if I come in and I want to do quite a lot of exploratory work in the editing suite, and sometimes the editing suite is a really good place to do that, part of the dynamic will be that the engineer, who in my case is actually doing the technical work, the editing work, while I'm doing the listening and the dancing around and pointing at the waveforms and everything, will find it tiring. So there is a tension built into even idealistic situations like that. But back to that idea of cover. Where there can really be a problem is where there isn't necessarily a true shared understanding of what the musical aesthetic is or the language of what is being recorded. This can reveal itself in a lack of sympathy with the material, and this will inevitably translate into poor outcomes. I remember being horrified with a producer with whom I don't work anymore, recording works by really a major composer, which turned out to be very successful recordings, although he was only involved on one of them. He'd been hired to do this, and the composer who'd come in from Germany was there, and he not only made it clear to me, but also to the composer, he was being paid during the recording, that he didn't like the music, that he didn't think it was any good. This, of course, is a real problem, but also he was labouring under the delusion, which no one should labour under, that it was somehow a useful demonstration of his authority to kind of demonstrate some kind of superiority over the material itself. The next problem with the I've got cover attitude is that the voice in the box, which is what I'm going to call the producer for now, might be working to an agenda to which the artist is not privy. And there is an implication here, and it's one to which I'm pretty allergic, that the artist will not understand. I confess that I kick hard against the very often stated notion that the producer is the person who makes the performance, the reading, the interpretation, saves the player from themselves, and is there to a degree to remedy or even abuse the player, and that we as mere note players are not capable of understanding what we're doing. Of course, this has a particularly interesting dynamic when you think about the troubling relationship between performers and whatever it is that conductors do. It's worth saying that the most successful conductors in the recording studio are those who best understand the process and are able to make the recording studio a place where players can do the thing that they do. I think a conductor like Stokowski is fascinating in this regard, in as much as that his work is very, very close to the work of the great movie moguls who would never have described themselves as movie directors, particularly someone such as Selznick before the Second World War, who knew that the making of a piece of art was primarily about getting the ingredients into the room and organizing them in a way that they could do their work most effectively and most freely whilst not getting in the way. But the question is still there, and I'm not sure that there is really a right answer, because I assume that you and we are looking for the most true, the most exciting, the most beautiful, and the most faithful rendition of music. And these things don't always necessarily fit into the same space. Back to my recording a session late on Monday night. I remember that one of the challenges of this question on the other side, the ideal side, is how do we say enough is enough? Now, for me, I have an odd problem, which is I don't find playing the violin tiring. And after years of doing this, my playing doesn't get ragged when I've played for 5 hours straight. But I realized that recording, just like what Gould would call the non-take two performance, needs a cut-off point. An understanding that it's just as important to say, we've got it, as to say, let's try it again. Now, recently I conducted a straw poll of a few colleagues who self-produce for their commercial recordings. I asked them in general that if they were doing 4 or 5 takes of each passage or more, when they came to making their edit maps, which did they generally end up using? The average answer, if you like, the mean answer, was the penultimate one. The liberation that comes from knowing you aren't necessarily doing your final take. It doesn't all have to be there, but you've moved enough into the material that you're free. That in itself is interesting. But another question is the allure of the first take. I occasionally, in moments of vanity, have fallen prey to this. The first recording I did with my regular engineer, Jonathan Haskell, many years ago, was a disc of Paganini. And the first thing we did was an unpublished Paganini Caprice. It was the first thing we recorded together, and I was really determined that I wanted to begin our collaboration at a run. So it's a short piece, only 3-4 minutes long. So I recorded it. It went fine. And I said, we've got it. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, that was great, wasn't it? Now, in retrospect, this was a really bad idea. There's nothing wrong with that particular recording, but there's nothing right about it either. By the same token, before I go back to this first take thing, it's worth saying that I also experienced what happens when so much work has been done that the producer, and again, as you probably worked out, I don't exist in a world where I work with producers that much, where the producer had the chance effectively to impose their idea on the recording altogether. This was a recording I did, which is still in the catalogue of a cycle of 19th century works of violin and piano. And it was the first time, it was for a Russian recording company. I was very excited about working with the producer, who wanted me to know that it wasn't exciting that I was working with him because he'd worked with Gideon Kramer and etc., etc., etc. And in the couple of days recording, I didn't really think much about the fact that there were certain priorities that he seemed to have, which were smooth renditions of climactic versions and beginnings and ends of things. I found out when the first edit arrived, what had happened was his strategy effectively was to remove things which I now know are very important to me as an artist. They don't have to be important to other people, but they're important to me, which is a certain kind of vertiginous effect. He'd used the control that he took of the recording session to reduce what I'd seen as a kind of like an alpine landscape to something more like the Cotswolds. The result is a recording I don't recognize at all. But let's go back to that elusive first take. Or perhaps really it's a question of, the question I'm really dealing with is knowing how when to say enough is enough. In 1997, the ultimate self-producing, self-directing actor Clint Eastwood, who ever since he made his amazing film about Charlie Parker in the 1980s, has directed and produced all of his movies himself. He made the film Absolute Power in 1997 with amazing cast, including Gene Hackman, Laura Linney, and amongst others, Ed Harris. Now, you may remember that in this film, which I do recommend you see, Eastwood plays an aging cat burglar, and Harris, the detective who's out to get him. There's a kind of to and fro between them, and they meet for the first time for coffee in a museum cafe, and it's early in the film. And there's a dryly amusing interchange with veiled threat between the two, with a grin. This was the first scene that Ed Harris had shot with Eastwood, and the first time he'd worked with him at all. They talked about the scene, and then Eastwood said action. They did the sequence once, and Eastwood said, print it, cut and reset. Harris was flabbergasted. Surely, he said to Eastwood, we're going to do it again. Eastwood, he said, looked at him and raised an eyebrow and said, well, you and I, we're both good actors, and we know that was good. We could try it again, we could F around a little, and after a few hours, if we're lucky, we might get it as good as what we just did. Or we can move on. Now, I'm not saying that's a good approach generally to recording. And as you've heard earlier, I'm not advocating only having one take. But Eastwood understands something we all need to take away and build into how we work.